The fluorescent lights of Cedar Ridge Animal Control buzzed overhead like wasps trapped behind cheap glass, casting a sickly pallor over the long corridor where Kennel 7 sat behind a reinforced gate of welded steel. The dog inside had not eaten in 2 days. He had not slept in 3. 91 days he had lived in that concrete cell, and in 3 hours he would not be living anywhere at all. Marshall Doyle, the facility director, glanced at the clock on the far wall, then at the syringe case resting on the rolling metal cart beside him. 8 in the morning. By 11, Kennel 7 would be empty, scrubbed clean, ready for the next animal nobody wanted. Doyle was not a cruel man, not by the standards he had set for himself, but he was a man who believed in the orderly closing of files, and the file in his hand had been open far too long. The name printed at the top in faded ink read Titan. Beside it, in red marker, someone had written the word dangerous in capital letters, underlined twice. 3 handlers bitten, 1 transport officer hospitalized, a volunteer trainer who had walked out in tears. The recommendation at the bottom of the page was simple and final. Doyle reached for the cart. Then the door at the far end of the corridor opened. The man who entered moved slowly, deliberately, the soft tap of a white cane preceding him along the polished concrete floor. He was somewhere past 40, broad through the shoulders, even under the worn canvas of his field jacket, his hair cropped short and shot through with premature gray at the temples. Dark glasses rested over eyes that had not seen the world in nearly 4 years. Behind him trailed Sarah Whitman, the volunteer who had spent the last 3 months trying to save the animal in Kennel 7, her face pale and drawn from too many sleepless nights and too many phone calls that had ended in no. Doyle frowned. He had not expected company. "Mr. Hayes," Sarah said quietly, her voice catching just slightly. "We're here." Caleb Hayes nodded once, the muscles along his jaw tightening. He could not see the kennel ahead of him, could not see the dog inside, could not see the syringe or the man holding it, but he could hear. He could hear the low animal breathing from somewhere beyond the steel, ragged and shallow, the sound of a creature long past hope. He took another step forward, then another, his cane tapping the concrete in a steady rhythm. Inside Kennel 7, Titan's breathing stopped. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be argued about in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Some would say the dog had simply been startled. Others would insist on something more, something the rational mind had no language for. But every person standing in that corridor agreed on one thing. The German shepherd who had attacked 3 grown men, who had been declared too dangerous to live, rose from the cold floor of his kennel in absolute silence and pressed his scarred forehead against the steel gate exactly where Caleb Hayes was about to lay his hand. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Caleb Hayes had been a soldier once, the kind of soldier his grandfather would have been proud of, and at 42 his hands still carried the calluses of a life shaped by discipline and dust. He had grown up in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, in the same 2-story farmhouse at the edge of town where he now lived alone, the property his grandfather had left him when the old man passed in the spring of his last deployment. Caleb had joined the Marines at 19, served 3 tours, earned a Bronze Star he never displayed, and a Purple Heart he never spoke of. The roadside bomb outside Kandahar had taken his sight in a single white flash on a stretch of asphalt he could no longer remember. 4 years had passed since then. 4 years of learning to navigate a house by the sound of his own footsteps. 4 years of his sister Hannah calling from Denver every Sunday afternoon to ask if he was eating. 4 years of a VA counselor whose voice he liked, but whose advice he rarely followed. The medications they prescribed sat in a row above the bathroom sink, each bottle marked in raised braille labels Sarah Whitman had pressed on for him during one of her visits. He took the antidepressants. He left the sleeping pills untouched. He had come to the shelter that morning by accident, or by what he allowed himself to call accident. The truth was that he had been hearing about the dog in Kennel 7 for 3 weeks now, ever since Sarah had stopped by with a sack of groceries and a story about a former police dog whose handler had been killed in the line of duty. Sarah had not asked him to take the dog. She knew better than that. She had simply talked about him while Caleb stood at the counter slicing tomatoes by touch, and the talking had landed somewhere deep in him and refused to leave. That morning, somewhere around 4, he had sat up in bed with the certainty he was going to the shelter before the doors opened. He could not explain why. He only knew that something in him recognized something in that animal across a distance he could not measure with his eyes. The dog they called Titan had been bred for police service in a kennel outside Fort Collins and trained in narcotics detection by the age of 2. His handler had been Officer Daniel Briggs of the Cedar Ridge Police Department, a 31-year-old patrolman with 2 small children and a wife who taught 4th grade at the same elementary school where Sarah's mother had once worked. For 6 years, Briggs and Titan had been inseparable, working drug interdiction along the Interstate 70 corridor and earning a string of commendations that filled an entire wall of the precinct lobby. Then, on a cold November night the previous year, Officer Briggs had responded to what was logged as a routine traffic stop on a service road outside town. Titan was in the back of the cruiser. By the time backup arrived, Briggs was dead on the asphalt with 2 rounds in his chest. The suspect vehicle was gone, and Titan was crouched over his handler's body, refusing to let any human being come within 10 feet. It had taken animal control 4 hours and a tranquilizer dart to remove him. He had not been the same animal since. He had bitten 3 handlers, hospitalized a transport officer, and earned the red ink across his file. The department had quietly washed its hands of him. Sarah Whitman had not. At 36, with auburn hair she rarely bothered to brush and a temper she kept on a short leash, Sarah ran the volunteer rehabilitation program at the shelter and held a part-time veterinary license she had earned at Colorado State a decade earlier. She had watched Titan for 3 months. She had read every page of his file. She had stood at his kennel for hours at a time, while he ignored her, growled at her, once lunged at her so hard the gate had rattled in its frame. She had never raised her voice. She did not believe Titan was dangerous in the way the file claimed. She believed he was grieving, and she believed that the system was about to put down a grieving animal because grief was harder to chart than aggression. She had run out of arguments and out of time. Caleb Hayes had been her last call. Sergeant Roy Calloway, retired now from the Cedar Ridge Police after 31 years and 4 heart attacks, had been Daniel Briggs's training officer and the closest thing Briggs had to a father after his own had walked out. At 63, Roy still kept his salt-white mustache trimmed to regulation and still drove a department-issued truck even though the department had stopped paying for the gas. He had been the one who carried the folded flag to Briggs's widow. He had been the one who insisted on attending every shelter board meeting where Titan's fate was discussed. And he had been the one, 3 weeks ago, who had sat across from Sarah Whitman at a diner on Main Street and said quietly that there were things about the night Daniel died that had never sat right with him. He had not said more. He had not needed to. Sarah had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Marshall Doyle was a man of 54 who wore the title of facility director as though it were a uniform, which in a sense it was. He had served on the Cedar Ridge Town Council for 9 years before taking the post at Animal Control, and he had a brother on the police force and a cousin who sat on the planning commission, and he knew the way decisions moved through a small town because he had spent his life moving them. He was not a cruel man. He told himself this often. He believed in protocols, in paperwork, in the orderly closing of files. He had been told the dog in Kennel 7 was dangerous, and he believed what he had been told, because the alternative would have required him to ask questions he did not want to ask. Now he stood in the corridor with the rolling cart beside him and watched the blind veteran lay his hand flat against the steel gate of Kennel 7. The dog on the other side did not move, did not growl, did not breathe, or so it seemed. Sarah held her hand to her mouth. "Open it," Caleb said softly. Doyle blinked. "Mr. Hayes, that animal has attacked 3 handlers. I am not authorized to." "You're the director," Caleb said. "You can authorize anything you want. Open it." There was no challenge in his voice. There was only the quiet certainty of a man who had stopped being afraid of most things on a road outside Kandahar 4 years earlier. Sarah stepped forward. "Marshall," she said, "please." Doyle exhaled slowly. He looked at the clock. He looked at the syringe. He looked at the dog who had not moved a muscle since the blind man had laid his hand on the gate. And then, against every instinct his decades of paperwork had taught him, he reached for the key on his belt. The lock turned with a small mechanical click. The gate swung inward an inch. Caleb did not step into the kennel. He did not call to the dog. He simply lowered himself to his knees on the polished concrete and held out one open hand, palm up, the way his grandfather had taught him to greet a horse he did not know. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a soft pressure, warm and rough and trembling, settled into the center of his palm. The scarred muzzle of a German shepherd who had not let a human being touch him in 91 days. Caleb did not flinch. He did not move. His thumb traced a slow circle along the side of the muzzle, finding the puckered line of an old scar that ran from the corner of the dog's mouth to the underside of his jaw. The dog leaned into the touch. From somewhere deep inside that ribbed and hollow chest came a sound that was not a growl. It was almost a sigh. "I know," Caleb murmured, "to no one and to everyone. I know what it's like." Sarah Whitman was crying without sound, her hands still pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Marshall Doyle stood in the corridor with a syringe on his cart and a paperwork file in his hand, and no idea, none at all, what to do with what he had just seen. The clock on the wall ticked past 8:15. The paperwork took less than 20 minutes. Doyle wrote slowly, his pen scratching across line after line of liability waivers and transfer forms, and twice he glanced up at Caleb Hayes as though hoping the blind man would change his mind. Caleb did not. Sarah signed as witness. Roy Calloway, who had been called by Sarah on the drive over and had arrived during the last of the forms, signed beneath her in handwriting that had grown shaky with age but had not lost its precision. $200 changed hands. A worn leather leash was produced from a supply cabinet. The dog they had called Dangerous walked out of Kennel 7 with no fuss at all, his shoulder brushing lightly against Caleb's left thigh, his head turned upward as though he were already learning to watch a world his new man could not see. Outside, the early sun was burning the frost off the parking lot, and the air smelled of pine smoke from somebody's fireplace down the road. Roy held the truck door open while Caleb settled Titan onto the bench seat. The shepherd lay down without prompting, his chin coming to rest against the worn denim of Caleb's knee. Sarah leaned through the driver's window. "I'll follow you out," she said. "I want to be there when you get him home." "Appreciate it," Caleb said. He paused. "Sarah, yeah. He's been waiting for someone." She did not answer for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin. "I think you might be right." Roy climbed in behind the wheel, and the truck rolled out of the lot and turned south onto the two-lane road that wound out toward the edge of town. Behind them, Marshall Doyle stood at the glass door of Cedar Ridge Animal Control and watched them go, the unused syringe still resting on the rolling metal cart by his feet, his hand pressed flat against the glass. He did not know yet what had just been set in motion. None of them did. But somewhere in the foothills above the town, a long silence was about to break. The road south of Cedar Ridge climbed gradually through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen still bare from a long winter, the asphalt narrowing as it left the town behind. Roy drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gear shift, and he did not speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Caleb did not speak either. He sat very still in the passenger seat, with his hand resting lightly on the back of the dog's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of breathing that had grown deeper and slower with every mile they put between themselves and the kennel. Titan had not moved since they had left the parking lot. He had not whined, had not shifted, had not lifted his head. He lay across the bench seat with his chin against Caleb's knee, and his amber eyes half closed, and from time to time the breath he exhaled stirred against the canvas of Caleb's field jacket, like the breath of something coming slowly back to life. The farmhouse at the edge of Caleb's grandfather's land had been built in 1957 from quarried stone and rough-cut timber, and it sat at the end of a quarter-mile dirt drive that wound up between two old hayfields gone to grass. There was a wraparound porch that creaked in the wind, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that Caleb still used, and a small barn out back where his grandfather had once kept 2 quarter horses and a Jersey cow. The horses and the cow had been gone for years now. The barn was empty except for some old tack and a workbench that Caleb's hands still remembered well enough to use. Roy stopped the truck at the foot of the porch steps and killed the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Caleb said quietly, "You want to come in for coffee?" "Maybe in a bit," Roy answered. "I think the dog ought to see the place first without 3 people standing over him." Caleb nodded once. He opened the passenger door slowly, swung his legs out, and let his cane unfold against the gravel. Titan rose from the seat without being asked. He jumped down to the ground in a single fluid motion, and he stood for a long moment with his nose lifted to the cold mountain air, taking in the scent of pine and old wood smoke and the dry grass of the hayfields. Then he turned his head toward Caleb and waited. "Come on then," Caleb said. They walked up the porch steps together, the man and the dog, the cane tapping out a quiet rhythm against the weathered boards. Sarah's truck pulled into the drive behind them as Caleb reached the door. She climbed out with a canvas bag of supplies in one hand and a folded crate mat under her arm, and she stopped at the bottom step and watched the dog enter the house at Caleb's side, as though he had been entering it for years. The first 3 days at the farmhouse passed without incident, which itself was the most remarkable thing about them. Titan did not eat on the first night. Sarah had warned Caleb that this might happen, and Caleb did not press. He set a steel bowl of dry food and a second bowl of water by the kitchen door, and left them there, and he sat at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and listened. He could not see the dog, but he could hear him, the soft click of nails on the hardwood floor as Titan moved from one room to another, mapping the house the way a soldier maps a building he is going to have to defend. By the second night, the food bowl was empty. By the third night, Titan was sleeping on a folded blanket at the foot of Caleb's bed. He did not lie on the blanket exactly. He lay across the threshold of the bedroom door with his back to the hallway and his head turned outward, the way a watchman lies down. Caleb understood without being told. The dog was on post. Sarah came every morning that first week, sometimes with groceries and sometimes only with a thermos of coffee from the diner on Main Street, and she would sit on the porch with Caleb for an hour or two while Titan paced the perimeter of the yard. She did not say much. She did not need to. She watched the way the shepherd's hackles slowly settled, the way his tail began to lift from its tucked position, the way his amber eyes followed Caleb across a room without the wariness she had seen in the kennel. On the fourth morning, she brought a copy of Titan's old training records, photocopied at the precinct by a clerk who owed her a favor. She set them on the kitchen table between 2 mugs of coffee. He was certified at 20 months, she said quietly. Top of his class. Drug interdiction, suspect apprehension, search and rescue. He had a working vocabulary of 53 commands in 2 languages. Caleb's hand rested on the edge of the table. 2 languages, English and Dutch, Sarah said. The trainers at the Fort Collins kennel used Dutch for tactical commands. It keeps a dog from responding to civilians by accident. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He turned his head slightly, in the direction where Titan was lying on the rug by the stove. Then he said one word in a low voice. Zit, the sound of nails on hardwood. The soft, heavy weight of a dog rising and crossing the room in 3 quick strides. The shifting of muscle as he came to a perfect seated position at Caleb's left side, his shoulder pressing lightly against the leg of the chair. Sarah did not say anything. She did not need to. Caleb reached down and laid his open hand on the dog's head, and for a long time the only sound in the kitchen was the slow ticking of the wall clock and the low, contented breathing of a German shepherd who had remembered who he was. Folks, before this story goes any further, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is when this video is reaching you. We are a long way from finished here, and I want to know who is riding along with us tonight, whether it is morning where you are, or whether the sun has gone down already and the kettle is on. We post a new story like this one every single day on this channel, so if this is your first time with us, hit that subscribe button while you are thinking about it. Now let's get back to Cedar Ridge, because the dog had remembered who he was, and that meant somebody else was about to remember something too. Roy Calloway came up the dirt drive on a Tuesday evening near the end of that first week, his department-issued truck rattling over the cattle guard at the bottom of the property. He carried a manila folder under one arm and a 6-pack of root beer in his other hand. The root beer was a 30-year habit. He had quit drinking the year his wife died, and root beer was what he brought when he had something serious to say. Caleb heard the truck from the porch and stood up. Titan rose with him, ears forward, body angled toward the sound. He did not bark. He had not barked once since coming to the farmhouse, and Sarah had told Caleb privately that she did not know whether he could anymore. Roy came up the porch steps with the heavy, careful tread of a man with 2 bad knees and set the root beer on the porch rail. He looked at the dog for a long moment. "Hello, partner," he said softly. Titan watched him. He did not approach, but he did not retreat either. After a moment, the shepherd lowered himself onto his haunches at Caleb's left side and waited. Roy nodded slowly. "He's a good dog," he said. "He was always a good dog. He wasn't ever what they said he was at the end." Caleb gestured to the porch chairs. "Sit, we've got time." They sat. Roy popped the cap on a bottle of root beer with the edge of the porch rail and handed one to Caleb, who set it on the boards beside his chair without drinking. The folder lay flat on Roy's knee. For a while neither man spoke. The sun was going down behind the foothills, and Caleb could feel the change in the temperature on his face, the slow cooling of the spring evening. "Tell me," he said finally, Roy exhaled. "I've been trying to tell somebody for 10 months, he said. Nobody at the department wants to hear it. They closed the file on Daniel Briggs the day after they buried him." Caleb waited. Roy opened the folder. "The traffic stop that night," he said. "Daniel called it in at 22:17. He gave the location and the plate number, and he said he was approaching the vehicle. That was the last transmission. 3 minutes later, a passing motorist saw the cruiser sitting empty on the shoulder with its lights on, called 911. By the time the next unit got there, Daniel was on the ground, and the vehicle was gone." Caleb's hand had come to rest on Titan's head. "The plate," he said. Roy nodded, even though Caleb could not see him. The plate came back to a 68-year-old woman in Grand Junction who hadn't driven the car in 2 years. It was sitting in her son-in-law's garage, stolen tag. So who did Daniel pull over? "That," Roy said, "is the question nobody wanted to answer." He paused. There were tire tracks at the scene that didn't match anything we ran down. There was a partial boot print in the dirt off the shoulder that the lab said came from a tactical boot. Daniel was shot twice with a .40 caliber. Recovered the rounds, ran the ballistics. No match in any database. Caleb turned his face slightly. "You're telling me a professional." "I'm telling you," Roy said, "that whoever shot Daniel that night knew what they were doing and knew how to disappear afterward. And somebody at the department decided very quickly that this was an unsolvable highway robbery and closed it up." Caleb was quiet. "And Titan," he said finally. Roy looked at the dog. "Titan was in the back of the cruiser," he said, "locked in. They figured he never saw anything. Sarah Whitman thinks different. So do I." Caleb's hand moved slowly along the dog's spine. "Why are you telling me this, Roy?" Roy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because the night Daniel was killed, he called me. About an hour before the stop. He said he was working on something he couldn't put through normal channels. He said he thought there was a leak in the department. He said he wanted to come by the next morning and talk it out with me over coffee." The hand on Titan's spine stilled. "He never made it," Roy said quietly. "And I've been carrying that phone call for 10 months. Caleb's voice was low. "You think it wasn't a robbery?" Roy closed the folder. "I think Daniel Briggs pulled over the wrong vehicle on purpose, and somebody made sure he didn't come home. And I think that dog at your knee is the only living witness to what happened on that shoulder." The porch was quiet. Somewhere out beyond the hayfields, an owl called twice and then went silent. Titan had not moved. His amber eyes were on Roy, and the breath that came out of him was slow and steady and absolutely aware. Caleb did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was very quiet. "What do you want me to do?" Roy looked out at the darkening fields. "I don't know yet," he said, "but that dog has been trying to tell somebody something for 10 months, and you might be the first person he's met who can hear him." Caleb turned his face slightly toward the dog. "Titan," he said softly. The shepherd shifted, pressing his head a little harder into the open palm of his blind man's hand. Outside, the last of the light went out of the sky behind the mountains. Inside the empty barn, a small brown shoebox that had not been opened in nearly a year sat on the workbench Caleb's grandfather had built, and inside that shoebox was a folded scrap of paper with a phone number on it, a phone number that Sarah Whitman had found in the lining of Titan's old service vest 2 days after the funeral and had told no one about, because she had not known yet who in Cedar Ridge could be trusted. She was about to find out,